You don't know who you're humiliating, Nia Brooke said, her voice steady enough to slice through the clinking glasses and logers humming across the room, and for a split second, everything in the restaurant seemed to pause as if the chandeliers themselves were holding their breath, the golden light catching on polished silverware and crystal rims while 40 conversations dissolved into a single, tightening silence. She stood near the center aisle, shoulders squared, her dark green dress, simple but elegant, now marked by a spill that dripped slowly toward the marble floor, and across from her, the manager's expression hardened, lips curling into something rehearsed and dismissive. "We have policies," he said, holding up a thin receipt between two fingers like it was a verdict, "and right now, you're violating them." A ripple of murmurs spread outward, subtle at first, then sharper. A woman near the bar leaned closer to her companion, whispering behind manicured nails, "A man in a navy blazer shook his head as if the outcome had already been decided, and Nia could feel it, not the judgment itself, but the weight of how quickly it formed, how easily people chose a side when it cost them nothing. She exhaled slowly, not looking away. "Then show it," she replied, calm, controlled, her hands resting at her sides instead of clenched, because she refused to give them anything they could twist into something else. The manager let out a short laugh, too loud, too forced. "Oh, we will," he said, gesturing toward a young server who shifted uncomfortably, eyes flickering down. "We already reviewed the situation," he added, louder now, for the room, for the audience that had unknowingly gathered, and just beyond the edge of that invisible circle, a man sat alone at a corner table, his glass of bourbon untouched, ice barely melted. William Carter had built empires by reading rooms faster than numbers, and right now, this room was louder than any boardroom he'd ever stepped into, not in volume, but in assumption. He watched the way the manager's confidence leaned too hard, the way the server avoided eye contact, the way Nia didn't crumble, didn't shrink, didn't plead, and that told him more than anything else. He leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing, not in judgment, but in calculation, because something didn't fit, not the posture, not the rhythm, not the silence that followed her words. "I didn't take anything," Nia said, not raising her voice, not needing to, because somehow it carried anyway, threading through the tension like a quiet truth people weren't ready to hold. A fork clinked against a plate somewhere in the distance, too loud now, out of place. The manager shook his head, already stepping forward. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave," and there it was, the final move, the easy exit dressed up as procedure. A few heads nodded, relieved, ready for the discomfort to end, but Nia didn't move, not an inch, her chin lifted just enough to meet his eyes fully. "No," she said, and the word didn't echo, didn't need to, it settled into the space like something immovable, something real, and across the room, William Carter finally set his glass down, the soft tap against the table cutting cleaner than any raised voice. He rose slowly, the quiet authority of someone used to being listened to without asking, and as he stepped forward, one measured step at a time, conversations didn't just stop, they disappeared, because something had shifted, something unseen but undeniable, and for the first time since the glass had shattered, the room wasn't watching Nia anymore, it was watching him, and he hadn't said a single word yet. The sound of William Carter's shoes against the marble floor was not loud, but it carried, each step measured, unhurried, and impossible to ignore, the kind of sound that did not demand attention yet somehow commanded it anyway. And as he moved closer, the invisible line that had formed around Nia shifted, people stepping back without realizing they were doing it, giving space not to her, but to him. Because power had a way of rearranging a room before it even spoke, the manager straightened instantly, his posture tightening, his tone adjusting before a single word was exchanged. "Sir," he said, forcing a polite smile that did not quite reach his eyes, "we are handling a situation, but..." William did not respond immediately. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze moving not to the manager, but to the floor, to the faint trail of liquid reflecting the overhead lights, then to the table beside it, then finally to Nia, and in that brief moment, there was something unspoken, something that did not belong to the noise around them, something quieter, sharper, like recognition without introduction. Nia held his gaze. Not with defiance, not with relief, but with a calm certainty that did not ask for permission, and that was the detail William noticed most, because in rooms like this, people either shrank or performed, and she was doing neither. "What exactly are you handling?" William asked at last, his voice even, not raised, yet it cut through the space more cleanly than any accusation that had come before it. The manager hesitated for half a second, just long enough for doubt to flicker, then recovered, lifting the receipt again as if it could anchor his version of events. "She has been identified as taking something that does not belong to her," he said carefully, choosing each word as though rehearsed. "And we have already verified the situation." A murmur of agreement rose again, softer this time, more cautious, because now the room was listening differently, and William's expression did not change, not even slightly. "Already verified," he repeated, almost as if testing the phrase. Then his eyes shifted briefly to the young server standing behind the manager, the same one whose shoulders were drawn in, whose hands were clasped too tightly, whose eyes refused to meet anyone else's, and that detail lingered. "Just long enough." "Yes, sir," the manager said quickly, sensing the need to fill the silence. "We reviewed everything internally." William nodded once, slow, thoughtful, as if considering something far larger than the moment itself. Then he took a small step to the side, not closer to the manager, but closer to the edge of the circle, where the tablet used for reservations rested on its stand. "Then let us review it again," he said, and this time, there was no room for interpretation. The words did not sound like a suggestion, and the shift in the room was immediate, subtle but undeniable, a tightening of shoulders, a pause in breathing, the kind of silence that comes when control begins to slip. The manager blinked, clearly caught between compliance and resistance. "Sir, that really is not necessary," he replied, but his voice had lost its earlier certainty, and somewhere near the back, a chair scraped softly against the floor, too loud in the stillness. William's gaze returned to him, steady, patient, but unyielding. "If it is already verified," he said, "then it will not take long." The logic was simple, almost gentle, but it landed with weight, because it left no space to refuse without exposing something else. The manager swallowed, glancing briefly toward the server again, then back to William, and in that flicker, the room saw it too, not clearly, not fully, but enough to feel that something was off, something just beneath the surface. And Nia watched all of it unfold without moving, her hand still at her sides, her expression unchanged, because she had seen this moment before. Not this room, not these people, but this pattern, the slow unraveling of certainty when truth is given space to breathe. And as the manager finally reached for the tablet, his fingers less steady than before, the entire room leaned into the silence, waiting, not for noise, but for something far more dangerous: clarity. The tablet screen flickered to life under the manager's trembling hands, its glow casting a pale reflection across his face as he hesitated for just a fraction too long before tapping into the security system. And in that hesitation, the room felt it, not as proof, not yet, but as a crack, small and quiet, spreading through what had moments ago seemed certain. William Carter did not move, his presence steady beside the stand, one hand resting lightly against the edge as if anchoring the moment. In place, his eyes fixed not on the manager, but on the screen, because that was where the truth would either hold or collapse. And behind them, the room leaned in without stepping forward, conversations gone, glasses untouched, even the soft music now distant, like it no longer belonged to the space. Nia stood where she had been, the faint shimmer of the spilled drink drying at her feet, her posture unchanged, her breathing even, because she understood something most of them did not, that truth did not need volume. It needed time, and time had just been given to it. "Here," the manager said, forcing confidence back into his voice as the footage loaded, his finger swiping across the screen too quickly, almost impatiently. "This is from 10 minutes ago." And the first clip appeared, grainy but clear enough, showing Nia standing near the table, the same angle the room had witnessed, her back partially turned, her bag resting against the chair, and at first glance, nothing seemed unusual. The manager straightened slightly, as if reassured by the familiar image. "You see," he began, but William raised a hand, not sharply, not rudely, just enough to pause the words before they could settle. "Let it play," he said quietly, and again. It was not a command spoken loudly, yet it carried the weight of one. The manager nodded, swallowing, and pressed play. The footage continued, seconds stretching longer than they should, every movement magnified by the silence in the room. A server passing behind Nia, another table shifting, a chair being adjusted, ordinary, forgettable details, until something changed, subtle at first, almost easy to miss. The same young server from earlier stepping into frame, his movements slower than before, his eyes flicking around the room, not in service, but in awareness. And William's gaze sharpened, not dramatically, just enough, because this was the detail he had been waiting for. The server paused behind Nia's chair, his hand hovering near her bag for a fraction of a second too long, then dipping quickly, too quickly to belong to routine. And in that moment, the room seemed to inhale all at once, the air tightening, the quiet shifting from passive to charged, the manager's shoulders stiffened beside the screen. His breath catching almost imperceptibly, but not enough to hide it entirely, and when the server stepped away, adjusting his expression back into something neutral, something practiced, the illusion that had filled the room just minutes ago began to fracture, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. Someone near the bar let out a soft, disbelieving exhale. Another voice whispered, "Wait, did you see that?" And now the whispers were different, no longer certain, no longer aligned, but questioning, searching, because once doubt enters a room, it does not stay contained. William did not look away from the screen, his voice calm when he finally spoke. "Run it again," and this time no one objected. The manager complied immediately. Rewinding the clip with fingers that no longer tried to appear steady, the footage replayed, slower now, each frame examined with new eyes, and what had been missed before became impossible to ignore. The deliberate movement, the glance over the shoulder, the careful placement, all of it visible, all of it real, and as the video ended, the silence that followed was no longer uncertain, it was heavy, complete, the kind that settles after truth has been revealed and there is nowhere left to look. But at it, Nia closed her eyes briefly, not in relief, not in triumph, but in recognition, because this moment was not new to her, only the setting had changed, and when she opened them again, she did not look at the manager, or the crowd, or even the screen. She looked at William Carter, because now the test had shifted, and it was no longer about what had happened, but about what would happen next. The silence did not break all at once, it fractured slowly, like glass under pressure, and every person in the room felt it, the shift from assumption to exposure, the weight of having witnessed something they could no longer ignore. The manager's hand remained frozen near the tablet, his fingers hovering as though the screen might somehow change if he did not touch it again, but it did not. The truth stayed exactly where it was, clear, undeniable, and quietly devastating. William Carter finally turned his head, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a calm precision that made the movement feel heavier than it should have, his gaze settling on the manager, and for the first time since he had spoken, there was something sharper behind it, not anger, not even disappointment, but clarity. "Would you like to explain it?" he asked, his voice even, almost courteous, but the question did not offer comfort, it demanded alignment with reality. The manager opened his mouth, then closed it again, the practiced confidence from earlier gone, replaced by something far less controlled. "Sir, this must be a misunderstanding," he said finally, but the words lacked structure, like they had not been fully formed before being released. And somewhere behind him, the young server shifted again. The movement small, almost invisible, but now impossible not to notice, because once the room had seen him in that footage, it could not unsee him, could not return him to the background where he had once belonged. "A misunderstanding," William repeated, slower this time, as if weighing the phrase, then he glanced briefly toward the server, not accusing, not pointing, just acknowledging the presence that had suddenly become central to everything. "Then it should be easy to clarify," he added. And the simplicity of the statement landed harder than any raised voice could have. The manager's shoulders tightened, his eyes flickering toward the server, then away, and in that single moment, the room saw the fracture widen, because truth does not only reveal itself in evidence, it reveals itself in hesitation, in the spaces between words, in the way someone avoids looking where they should. Nia watched quietly, her expression unchanged, because this part, this unraveling, was always the same, different faces, different places, but the same slow collapse when certainty is forced to face reality, and she did not step forward, did not speak again, because she understood something most of them did not, that once truth is visible, it does not need to be defended, it only needs to be allowed to exist. "Check his pockets," a voice murmured from somewhere near the back, not loud, not authoritative, just a suggestion carried by the tension in the room, and the words seemed to ripple outward, gaining weight as they moved, until even the server heard them, his posture stiffening, his hands tightening at his sides. "That will not be necessary," the manager said quickly, too quickly, his voice rising just enough to betray the urgency beneath it, and that was the moment everything shifted again, because the resistance itself became louder than any accusation. William did not raise his voice, did not step closer, he simply let the silence stretch, let it settle over the manager's words, and in that silence, the room leaned further away from him, not physically, but mentally, the alignment breaking, the certainty dissolving. "If it is not necessary," William said at last, "then you are certain of the outcome." And it was not a question, not really, it was a mirror, held up without distortion, and the manager could not answer it, not directly, not convincingly, because the truth had already spoken for itself, and now, the only thing left was choice, not for Nia, not for the room, but for him, whether to continue holding onto something that no longer existed, or to step into the reality everyone had just witnessed. Nia shifted her weight slightly, the smallest movement, but it drew attention, not because it was dramatic, but because it was deliberate, and when she finally spoke again, her voice was as calm as before, steady, unwavering. "You do not have to defend a lie that is already exposed," she said, not to challenge, not to accuse, but to state what had become obvious, and the words settled into the room with a quiet finality, because they did not escalate the moment, they completed it. And William Carter watched her as she spoke, not with surprise, not with curiosity, but with something deeper, something closer to recognition, because this was not just composure, this was control, not over others, but over herself, over the moment, over the narrative that had tried to define her. And for the first time since he had stood up, he realized something had shifted beyond the situation itself, something that was no longer about the accusation, but about the person standing in front of him. And the question that now lingered was no longer what had happened, but what this moment meant for everything that would follow. The manager's silence stretched too long, long enough for the room to shift again, not just in attention but in allegiance, because what had once been a clear narrative had dissolved into something far more uncomfortable, uncertainty, and uncertainty demanded resolution. The young server took a small step back, as if distance alone might remove him from the center of what was unfolding, but it only made him more visible, more exposed, his movements no longer blending into the background but standing out against it, and William Carter noticed that too, every detail, every hesitation, every glance that did not land where it should. Because patterns like this were not unfamiliar to him, they simply wore different suits in different rooms. "What is your name?" William asked, his voice shifting slightly, no longer directed at the manager, but at the server, and the question landed differently. It was not aggressive, not accusatory, but it was precise, targeted, and impossible to ignore. The server hesitated, his lips parting before any sound came out. "Daniel," he said finally, his voice quieter than before, almost swallowed by the weight of the room. William nodded once, acknowledging him not as an accessory to the situation, but as its center. "Daniel," he repeated, not unkindly, but firmly, "would you like to tell us what happened?" And the choice in the words was deliberate, not forcing, not cornering, but offering something else entirely, the opportunity to step into truth instead of being pulled into it. The manager shifted immediately, stepping slightly forward as if to intercept. "Sir, this is an internal matter," he said quickly, but the words felt weaker now, thinner, like they no longer had structure to stand on. William did not look at him, not this time. His attention remained on Daniel, steady, patient, waiting, and the room followed that focus, because it had learned something in the last few minutes, that where William looked, something important existed. Daniel swallowed, his hands tightening, then loosening, then tightening again. A silent rhythm of conflict playing out in small, visible ways, and for a moment, it seemed like he might say nothing at all, might let the silence carry him through, might hope that someone else would fill it, but no one did, because now the room understood. Its role was not to decide, but to witness. Nia remained still, her gaze not fixed on Daniel, not pressuring him, not urging him forward, but allowing him space, because truth spoken under force sounds different than truth chosen, and she knew the difference mattered. The seconds stretched, each one heavier than the last, until finally, Daniel exhaled, a small sound, but enough to break the hold of hesitation. "I was told to," he said. The words barely above a whisper, but in the silence, they carried, they landed, they changed everything. The manager's head snapped slightly toward him, not dramatically, but sharply enough to reveal something unguarded, something real. "That is not what happened," the manager said quickly, but the speed of the denial worked against him, not for him, because it came before the explanation, before the structure, before the truth could even be shaped. William finally turned his head, his gaze settling on the manager again, but now it was different, not searching, not questioning, but concluding. "Then you should have no issue with him finishing," he said, and the simplicity of it left no room for interruption. Daniel looked down for a moment, then back up, his voice steadier now, not strong, but clearer. He said, "We needed to make an example," he continued, each word measured, each one pulling the situation further into the light, "that it would show we were strict about policy." A murmur spread again, but this time it was not confusion, not doubt, it was recognition, the kind that comes when something hidden becomes visible in a way that cannot be undone. the manager stepped back slightly, his posture no longer controlled, his confidence no longer intact, because the narrative he had built had not just been questioned, it had been replaced. Nia closed her eyes for a brief moment, not in relief, but in acknowledgement, because this was the part people often misunderstood. That exposure was not the same as resolution, that truth did not erase what had already happened, it only changed what came next, and when she opened her eyes again, she did not look at the manager, she did not look at Daniel, she looked at William Carter, because now the room had seen the truth, but the outcome, the direction, the meaning of it all, that still remained unwritten, and in that quiet, suspended moment, it became clear that the real decision had not yet been made. The room did not erupt, it did not explode into chaos the way scenes like this often do, instead it sank into something heavier, something quieter, like a truth too large to react to all at once. Daniel's words lingered in the air, not dramatic, not forceful, but final in a way that no raised voice could ever achieve, and the manager stood there, caught in the space between denial and exposure, his mouth slightly open as if searching for something to say that no longer existed. William Carter did not rush to fill that silence, he let it breathe, because he understood that this moment was no longer about uncovering what happened, that part was already done, this was about what came after, about what people chose to do when the truth was no longer hidden. He shifted his weight slightly, his posture still relaxed, still composed, but there was a subtle change now, something more grounded, more deliberate, as if he had moved from observer to participant without needing to announce it. "You said you needed to make an example," William said, his voice returning to Daniel, not accusing, not pressing, just clarifying. Daniel nodded faintly, his eyes flickering toward the manager before settling somewhere near the floor again. "Yes, sir," he replied, and even now, the formality in his tone remained, a habit that had not yet caught up with the reality of what he had revealed. William let that sit for a moment, then turned his attention back to the manager, his gaze steady, unwavering. "An example of what?" he asked, and the question did not feel rhetorical, it felt surgical, precise, cutting directly to the intention beneath the action. The manager inhaled slowly, his chest rising just enough to show the effort it took. "We enforce standards," he said, the words returning to something rehearsed, something safer. "This establishment has a reputation," but even as he spoke, the room no longer leaned toward him, no longer followed his logic, because the foundation beneath it had already been removed. William nodded once, as if acknowledging the statement, then tilted his head slightly. "Standards," he repeated, and there was something in the way he said it, not disbelief, not mockery, but examination, like he was holding the word up to the light to see what it actually contained. "And those standards require creating a false situation," he continued, not raising his voice, not escalating, just layering the truth over the explanation until they could no longer exist together. The manager's jaw tightened, his composure slipping just enough to reveal the strain beneath it. "That is not what I said," he replied quickly, but now every word felt reactive, not controlled. William did not interrupt, did not argue, he simply let the contradiction sit between them, because contradiction has a way of revealing itself without assistance, and the room felt it again, that shift, that subtle turning away from the version of reality that no longer held. Nia watched quietly, her gaze steady, not on the manager, not on Daniel, but on William, because she understood what was happening now. This was no longer about proving anything, this was about accountability, about whether power would align itself with truth or retreat back into convenience, and she had seen both outcomes before, far too many times. "Reputation is built on consistency," William said after a moment, his tone calm, measured, "but consistency without integrity is just repetition," and the words landed differently than everything else that had been said. They did not accuse, they did not defend, they defined, and once something is defined clearly, it becomes harder to hide behind it. The manager looked at him, really looked at him this time, as if trying to gauge where this was going, as if trying to find an angle that had not yet closed, but there was none, because the direction had already been set. Not loudly, not dramatically, but decisively. Daniel shifted again, his shoulders lowering slightly, as if the weight he had been holding was no longer entirely his, and somewhere near the back, someone exhaled, a soft sound, almost unnoticed, but it carried relief. Not because the situation was resolved, but because it was no longer uncertain. William glanced briefly around the room, taking in the faces that had once watched with quiet judgment, now watching with something else entirely, something closer to awareness. Then his gaze returned to Nia, and for a moment, the noise, the tension, the entire room seemed to fade around that single point of focus, because in the end, this moment was not defined by the accusation, or the exposure, or even the explanation. It was defined by what came next, and that choice had not yet been spoken. The silence that followed did not feel empty, it felt full, dense with everything that had just been revealed and everything that still had not been decided, and in the center of it, William Carter stood without urgency, without spectacle, his presence steady as if he understood that the most important moments were not the loud ones but the ones where people had to choose who they were going to be next. He looked once more at the manager, not with anger, not with triumph, but with something far more difficult to face, expectation. "You said this place has standards," he began, his voice calm, measured, carrying easily across the room without needing force. "Then this is the moment where those standards either exist or they do not." The word settled into the space with quiet weight, and for the first time, the manager did not immediately respond, his posture shifting as if he were trying to regain control of something that had already slipped beyond reach. "Sir, I assure you we take this very seriously," he said finally, but now the tone sounded different, not confident, not assured, but searching, as though he were repeating something that no longer aligned with the reality in front of him. William nodded slightly, acknowledging the statement without accepting it, then his gaze moved, slowly, deliberately, back to Nia, and the room followed, because by now they had learned that where his attention settled, something meaningful would happen. Nia met his eyes again, calm as before, but there was something else there now, something deeper than composure, something like resolve that had nothing to do with the outcome of this moment and everything to do with who she had always been long before she walked into this room. William took a small step closer, not invading her space, not diminishing the distance, but bridging it just enough to change the dynamic. "You should not have had to stand here and prove anything," he said, his voice lower now, directed only to her, but still audible enough that the room could feel the shift in tone. This was no longer a question of facts, it was a recognition of something larger. Nia held his gaze for a second longer before responding, her voice steady, controlled. "I did not stand here to prove anything," she said, and there was no bitterness in it, no edge, just clarity. "I stood here because I refused to leave," and the simplicity of that statement carried more weight than any defense could have, because it reframed the entire moment. This had never been about convincing anyone of her innocence. It had been about refusing to accept a false narrative imposed on her, and that realization moved quietly through the room, shifting perspectives in ways that no argument ever could. William exhaled slowly, a subtle acknowledgement of the truth in her words, then straightened slightly, his attention returning to the broader space, to the people who had watched, who had assumed, who had remained silent until it was no longer comfortable to do so. "Accountability is not a performance," he said, his voice rising just enough to carry to the edges of the room. "It is a decision," and again, there was no accusation in it, no direct blame, just a statement that forced reflection. The manager shifted again, clearly feeling the weight of where this was heading. "We will handle this internally," he said quickly, trying to regain some sense of authority, but the words no longer held power, not after everything that had already unfolded. William turned his head slightly, his gaze resting on him once more, and this time, there was finality in it, not harsh, not aggressive, but unmistakable. "No," he said, and the single word landed heavier than anything else spoken that night, because it was not loud, it was not dramatic, it was simply certain. The room stilled again, every eye fixed on him as he continued. "You will handle this correctly," he added, and the distinction between the two statements was clear. One was about control, the other was about integrity, and only one of them still had a place in the room. Daniel stood quietly off to the side, his shoulders no longer as tense, his gaze no longer fixed on the floor, because the truth he had carried had finally been placed where it belonged, not hidden, not denied, but acknowledged. And Nia remained exactly where she was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, because she did not need to move, not anymore. The room had already shifted around her, and for the first time since the glass had shattered, the balance of power no longer leaned away from her. It stood level, waiting, because what happened next would not be decided by what had been revealed, but by what people chose to do with it. The word no did not echo, it settled, firm and immovable, and in its wake the entire room seemed to recalibrate, as if something invisible had been realigned, the kind of shift that does not make noise but changes everything. The manager stood there, his authority no longer anchored in confidence but suspended in uncertainty, because control had quietly transferred without announcement. And now he was standing in a structure that no longer belonged to him. William Carter did not move. Immediately after speaking, he allowed the weight of that single word to do its work, to travel across the space, to reach the edges of the room where people still stood frozen between reaction and realization. Then he stepped back slightly, not retreating, but repositioning, creating space not for himself, but for what needed to happen next. "You said you would handle this correctly," he continued, his voice calm, measured, leaving no room for misinterpretation. "So begin." And it was not an order shouted, it was something more powerful, an expectation that demanded alignment. The manager inhaled, a visible effort, his chest rising as though he were bracing himself against something unseen, and for the first time, he did not look at William for direction, he looked at Nia. Really looked at her, not as a problem, not as an interruption, but as the person at the center of what he now had to address, and that shift alone carried meaning, because acknowledgement is the first step toward accountability. He began, his voice lower now, stripped of the sharp edge it had carried earlier. "There has clearly been a mistake." The words came carefully, placed one after the other as though he were testing their stability, but even as he spoke them, the room knew they were not enough, because a mistake suggests accident, and nothing about what had been revealed felt accidental. Nia did not respond immediately. She let the silence exist between them, not to prolong discomfort, but to ensure that whatever came next would not be rushed into something incomplete. Her eyes remained steady on him, not harsh, not forgiving, simply present, and in that presence, there was no escape from the reality of the moment. The manager shifted again, sensing it, understanding that what he had offered was insufficient. What happened should not have happened. He corrected himself, the words slightly stronger now, closer to truth, but still not fully there, and William watched quietly, saying nothing, because this part could not be done for him, it had to be chosen. Daniel stood a few steps behind, his shoulders no longer tense, but his posture still cautious, as if unsure where he now belonged in a situation that had outgrown the role he had been given. And around them, the room remained silent, not out of discomfort now, but out of attention, because something more meaningful than spectacle was unfolding, something slower, more difficult, and far more real. Nia finally spoke, her voice calm, unwavering. "It did happen," she said, and the simplicity of the statement redirected everything, because it refused to soften the reality, refused to allow it to be minimized into something easier to accept. The manager nodded, a small movement, but genuine, and in that moment, something shifted again, not dramatically, not visibly, but internally, the kind of shift that changes how a person stands in their own decisions. "You are right," he said, and this time, the words did not sound rehearsed, they sounded grounded. It did happen, and for the first time since the situation began, the room felt something different, not tension, not judgment, but a fragile sense of alignment, because truth had been acknowledged without resistance. William's gaze softened slightly, not in approval, but in recognition, because this was the turning point, not the exposure, not the confrontation, but the moment someone chooses to stop defending what is no longer defensible. The manager took a breath, deeper this time, as if stepping fully into the responsibility he could no longer avoid. "We will correct this," he said, and while the words alone were not enough to undo what had already been done, they marked the beginning of something that could, if followed through, lead to something better. Nia held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, not as acceptance, not as closure, but as acknowledgement that the direction had finally shifted, and William Carter, standing just beside them, understood something clearly now. This was never about stepping in to rescue a situation, it was about ensuring that when the truth surfaced, it was not buried again under convenience. And as the room slowly exhaled, the weight of what had unfolded settling into something quieter, more lasting, it became clear that this moment, this single moment, would not end when people walked out of this restaurant. It would follow them, shaping what they noticed next time, what they questioned, what they chose to stand for, and that, more than anything else, was where real change began. The room did not return to normal, not yet, because something essential had shifted, something deeper than a resolved misunderstanding, and even as the manager stepped back, signaling quietly to another staff member to clear the area and reset the table, the atmosphere held onto what had just happened, like a memory refusing to fade. William Carter watched it all unfold without interruption, his posture unchanged, his expression calm. But there was a new stillness to him now, the kind that comes when a decision is forming beneath the surface, and Nia noticed it, not because he moved, but because he did not, because in a room where everyone else was adjusting, apologizing, recalibrating, he remained steady, as if the moment was not ending for him, only evolving. "We would like to offer you a complimentary meal," the manager said carefully, returning his attention to Nia, his tone respectful, measured, but still slightly tentative, as though he understood that what he was offering did not match what had occurred. And Nia glanced briefly at the table, at the spotless place setting that had been restored too quickly, too neatly, as if the disruption could be erased by presentation alone. Then she looked back at him, her expression calm, thoughtful. "I did not come here for a free meal," she said, her voice even, not dismissive, not unkind, just clear, and again, the simplicity of her words carried weight, because it stripped the situation down to what it actually was, not a service failure, not a customer complaint, but a question of dignity. The manager nodded slowly, absorbing it this time without trying to reshape it. "Understood," he replied, and there was something more grounded in the way he said it, something less performative, more real. William shifted slightly, his gaze moving between them, then settling on Nia, and for a moment, the room seemed to narrow again, not physically, but in focus, because something unspoken was about to become visible. "Then what did you come here for?" he asked, his voice quiet, directed only to her, but it carried enough for those nearby to hear, not as a challenge, but as an invitation to define the moment beyond what had happened. Nia held his gaze, considering the question not as something simple, but as something layered, something that reached beyond the walls of the restaurant itself. "I came here because I had a meeting," she said, and the words landed gently at first, almost ordinary, until their meaning began to unfold. The manager blinked, clearly not expecting that answer. "A meeting," he repeated, his voice uncertain, and Nia nodded once, her posture unchanged. "Yes," she said, then reached into her bag, the same bag that had been at the center of everything, the same object that had been used to construct a false narrative, and this time, as she opened it, no one looked away, no one assumed. The room watched with a different kind of attention, one shaped by what they had just learned. She pulled out a slim folder, dark leather, simple, professional, and placed it gently on the table, the sound soft but deliberate. "With the ownership group of this location," she added, and the silence that followed was immediate, complete, the kind that arrives when reality shifts faster than expectation can catch up. The manager's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough, his posture straightening again, but this time not out of authority, out of realization. "Ownership," he repeated, quieter now, as if the word itself carried weight he had not accounted for. William's gaze sharpened slightly, not in surprise, but in recognition, because suddenly, the pieces aligned in a way they had not before. The composure, the clarity, the refusal to leave, none of it had been random, none of it had been reactive. It had been grounded in something far more solid, something that existed long before the situation unfolded. Nia rested her hand lightly on the folder, not opening it yet, not needing to, because the meaning was already clear. "I was here to evaluate whether this location meets the standards it claims to uphold," she said, her voice calm, measured, and in that moment, the entire room understood that the situation had not just been reversed, it had been redefined, because the person they had watched being questioned had been the one asking the question all along. And now, as that realization settled over them, heavier than anything that had come before, the outcome of the night no longer belonged to assumption, or authority, or even exposure. It belonged to her. The word ownership did not echo, but it did not need to. It settled into the room with a weight that reshaped every glance, every posture, every assumption that had been made just minutes before. And the manager stood there, his earlier certainty replaced by something far more fragile, awareness, not just of what had happened, but of who it had happened to. His eyes moved from the folder on the table back to Nia, and this time there was no trace of dismissal, no attempt to reframe the situation into something manageable, only the quiet realization that the ground beneath him had shifted in a way he could not control. I was not informed," he said finally, his voice lower, stripped of the authority it once carried, and the sentence hung there, incomplete, because it did not resolve anything. It only revealed how unprepared he had been to recognize what was right in front of him. Nia did not respond immediately. She allowed the silence to stretch, not out of hesitation, but out of intention, because this moment was not about filling space with words. It was about letting the truth settle fully. "That is the problem," she said at last, her tone calm, measured, but precise. "You were not informed, but you also did not ask," and the distinction landed with quiet force, because it was not about a lack of information, it was about a lack of curiosity, a lack of willingness to question a narrative that felt convenient. The manager nodded slowly, the movement small but genuine, and for the first time, he did not try to correct or defend. He simply absorbed. William Carter watched the exchange closely, his gaze moving between them, and there was something thoughtful in the way he observed, not detached, not distant, but engaged in a way that suggested this moment carried meaning beyond the immediate situation. Standards, Nia continued, her hand still resting lightly on the folder, are not tested when everything is comfortable, she said. They are tested when something challenges what you expect to see, and the room listened differently now, not as spectators, but as participants in something they could not separate themselves from, because they had all been part of what had happened, whether through action or silence. The manager exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering as if the weight he carried had finally been acknowledged for what it was, not pressure from above, not expectation from the business, but responsibility for the choices he had made. You are right, he said again, and this time the words carried more than agreement, they carried acceptance, the kind that does not argue, does not deflect, but stands still long enough to recognize truth without resistance. Daniel shifted slightly behind him, his posture no longer tense, but not entirely relaxed either, because while the truth had been revealed, its consequences had not yet fully unfolded, and he understood that his role in this moment would not disappear simply because it had been spoken aloud. William took a slow breath, then stepped forward just enough to close the distance between himself and the table where the folder rested, his eyes moving briefly to it, then back to Nia. And what does your evaluation say? He asked, his voice calm, but there was something more beneath it now, something closer to genuine curiosity than controlled observation. Nia looked at him for a moment, as if weighing the question not for its content, but for its intent. Then she lifted the folder slightly, not opening it yet, just enough to acknowledge its presence as something more than an object. It says that a system is only as strong as the moment it is challenged, she replied, and the word settled into the space with a clarity that did not require explanation. The manager closed his eyes briefly, not out of frustration, but out of recognition, because he understood what she meant, not in theory, but in practice, in the reality of what had just unfolded. And when he opened them again, he looked at her not as someone trying to recover control, but as someone trying to understand what could still be done. Is there a way to fix this? He asked, and the question did not sound defensive, it sounded sincere, because it was no longer about protecting reputation, it was about repairing something that had been broken in a way that could not be undone. Nia held his gaze, her expression steady, thoughtful, and for a moment, the entire room seemed to wait, not for an answer, but for a direction. Because whatever she said next would not just determine the outcome of this moment, it would define what this place stood for moving forward. And William Carter, standing beside her, understood that clearly now. This was no longer a situation to observe or even to guide. It was a moment to witness, because the outcome no longer belonged to him, it belonged to her choice. Nia did not answer immediately, and that pause mattered. It stretched just long enough for the question to settle into something deeper than a request for resolution, because what the manager had asked was not simply how to fix a mistake, it was whether something broken at its core could truly be repaired. She let her fingers rest on the edge of the folder, feeling the texture beneath them, grounding herself in the present moment while the room waited in quiet anticipation, every eye on her, not with judgment now, but with expectation. And when she finally looked up, her gaze moved first to the manager, then briefly to Daniel, and then, for just a second, to William Carter, as if acknowledging that this moment existed because of a chain of choices, not just one. You do not fix this by correcting one incident, she said, her voice calm, steady, carrying clearly through the silence. You fix it by changing what made it possible. And the words did not land like a criticism, they landed like a blueprint, something that required more than reaction, something that required intention. The manager nodded slowly, absorbing each word, not interrupting, not defending, because he understood now that this was not a moment to explain, it was a moment to listen. That means your policies, your training, your assumptions. Nia continued, everything that allowed someone to believe this was acceptable. And as she spoke, the room seemed to lean in again, not out of tension, but out of recognition, because what she was describing was larger than this restaurant, larger than this single moment. It was a pattern, one that existed in quiet ways until it was exposed like this, undeniable and impossible to ignore. Daniel lowered his gaze slightly, not out of shame, but out of reflection, because her words did not isolate him, they included him in something broader, something that had influenced his choices without him fully understanding it at the time. William watched her carefully, his expression thoughtful, because what she was doing now was not simply responding, she was defining The terms of accountability, shaping the outcome in a way that could extend beyond this room. So yes, Nia said after a brief pause, her voice softening just slightly, there is a way to fix this, and the subtle shift in tone changed the atmosphere again, because it introduced something new, not just responsibility, but possibility. The manager straightened slightly, not in defense, but in attention. But it is not immediate, she added. And that clarity anchored the moment again, preventing it from becoming something superficial, something rushed. It starts with acknowledgement, which you have begun, she said, and the words were not praise, but they were not dismissive either, they were simply accurate, and accuracy carried its own kind of weight, and it continues with action that matches that acknowledgement, she finished, and the sentence closed the space between intention and outcome, making it clear that one without the other would not hold. The manager took a slow breath, his shoulders rising and falling as if he were adjusting to the reality of what was being asked, not just a correction, but a transformation. We will make those changes, he said, and this time, the words did not feel like a promise made to recover reputation, they felt like a commitment made to align with truth, and that difference was subtle, but significant. Nia held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, not confirming success, but acknowledging direction, because direction was the only thing that could exist at this stage. Outcome would come later. William shifted slightly beside her, his posture relaxing just enough to signal that the tension he had been holding was no longer necessary, not because the situation was resolved, but because it had moved into something more meaningful, something that could continue beyond this moment. Then your evaluation is not final, he said quietly, his voice directed toward her, but audible enough to carry, and Nia allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile to touch her expression, not out of amusement, but out of recognition. No, she replied, it is not, and the simplicity of her answer left the future open, undefined, dependent not on what had happened, but on what would happen next. And as the room slowly began to shift again, people returning to their tables, conversations resuming in softer tones, something remained, something that would not disappear when the night ended, a heightened awareness, a memory of how quickly assumptions could form and how necessary it was to question them. And in the center of it all, Nia Brooks stood not as someone who had been wronged and then corrected, but as someone who had redefined the moment entirely. And William Carter, watching her, understood that what had just unfolded was not simply an incident, it was a standard being set, one that would not be easily forgotten. The room did not return to what it had been, even as chairs were quietly adjusted and glasses were refilled, because something had settled into the space that could not be cleared away with service or softened with music. It lingered in the way people glanced a second longer, in the way voices lowered before speaking, in the subtle awareness that had replaced assumption, and at the center of it, Nia Brooks stood with a stillness that did not demand attention but held it anyway, her hand resting lightly on the folder as if it were not just a document, but a marker of everything that had just unfolded. William Carter remained nearby, not imposing, not directing, but present in a way that suggested he understood this moment was not over, only transitioning into something quieter, more lasting. We will arrange a formal review, the manager said after a moment, his tone measured, deliberate, no longer reactive, but intentional. Not just here, but across all locations under my supervision. And the words carried differently now, not as a defense, but as a commitment shaped by what had been exposed. Nia listened without interruption, her gaze steady, because she was not measuring the words themselves, she was measuring the alignment behind them, the consistency between what was said and what would be done, and that was something no immediate response could fully confirm. That is where it begins, she replied calmly, and there was no softness in the statement, but there was no resistance either, just clarity, because beginnings were necessary, but they were not the same as outcomes. The manager nodded once, accepting the distinction without trying to close the gap too quickly, because he understood now that rushing to resolution would only repeat the same pattern in a different form. Daniel shifted slightly to the side, no longer standing in the center of attention, but no longer invisible either, his presence now part of the story, not hidden from it. And there was a quiet change in him, not dramatic, not outwardly expressed, but present in the way his shoulders no longer carried the same tension, as if the truth, once spoken, had released something he had not fully understood he was holding. William glanced briefly toward him, acknowledging that shift without drawing attention to it, because accountability did not always need to be announced, sometimes it only needed to be recognized. What matters now? Nia continued, her voice steady, drawing the room's focus once more without raising it, is not how quickly this is corrected, but how consistently it is upheld. and the words moved through the space with a quiet precision, because they removed any illusion of a simple fix, replacing it with something more demanding, something that required time, attention, and intention beyond a single moment. The manager took a slow breath, as if absorbing not just the instruction, but the responsibility behind it. "You have my word," he said, and while the phrase might have sounded routine before, now it carried a different weight, not because it was spoken, but because of everything that had led to it, and whether that weight would hold would not be decided here, but in the days and actions that followed. Nia gave a small nod, not confirming, not dismissing, simply acknowledging that the direction had been set, and that was enough for now. William shifted his stance slightly, the tension that had once held the room together now easing into something more natural, more balanced, as if the space itself had adjusted to a new understanding, and for a moment, the three of them stood there without speaking, not because there was nothing left to say, but because the most important things had already been said, and repeating them would not add anything more. Around them, the restaurant began to move again, not in the same way as before, but with a quieter awareness, conversations resuming with a different tone, gestures more deliberate, glances more thoughtful, as if everyone present carried a piece of what had just occurred with them, not as a spectacle, but as a reminder. And in that subtle shift, something meaningful had taken root. Something that would not be easily undone. Nia finally lifted the folder from the table, holding it with a light grip, not as something to present, but as something already understood. She did not open it, did not need to, because the evaluation it contained had already been expressed in a way far more powerful than any written report could capture. William watched her for a moment, then gave a slight nod, not formal, not performative, just a quiet acknowledgement of what had been established between them, not an agreement, not a conclusion, but a recognition. And as Nia turned slightly, preparing to step away from the center of the room, it became clear that the moment itself was not ending, it was simply changing form, moving from something visible to something lasting, something that would continue beyond this space, beyond this night, in ways that would only become clear with time. The moment did not end with a dramatic exit or a final declaration. It softened, settled, like the last note of a song that lingers just long enough to be felt before it fades. And as Nia Brooks took her first step away from the center of the room, the space seemed to shift around her once more, not in resistance, not in judgment, but in quiet acknowledgement, the kind that does not need to be spoken to be understood. Her heels moved gently across the marble floor, the same floor that had carried the sound of shattering glass not long ago, and now carried something entirely different, something steady, controlled, resolved. William Carter watched her for a moment, his gaze following not out of curiosity, but out of respect, because he understood that what had just happened was not about intervention, it was about presence, about allowing truth to stand without being overshadowed, and that was something far more difficult to do. He reached for the chair near the table she had been standing beside, pulling it back slightly with a quiet motion, not as a gesture of formality, but as an acknowledgement, a recognition of equality, of space shared rather than given. And when Nia paused briefly, glancing at the chair, there was a flicker of something unspoken between them, not agreement, not familiarity, but understanding, the kind that does not require explanation. She did not sit, not yet. Instead she let her gaze move across the room one last time, taking in the faces that had once watched her with assumption, now watching with something else entirely, something closer to awareness. And in that moment, the room felt different, not because of what had been said, but because of what had been seen. The manager stood a few steps away, no longer attempting to control the situation, no longer shaping it, but standing within it, aware of his place in what had unfolded and what would follow. Daniel remained nearby as well, quieter now, but not diminished, his presence no longer hidden, but integrated into the truth that had come forward. And for the first time, there was no need for him to step back or disappear, because the narrative had shifted to include him, not as a symbol of fault, but as part of a system that had been revealed. And systems, once revealed, could be changed. Nia finally turned back toward the table, her movements unhurried, her posture unchanged, and as she placed the folder gently onto the surface once more, she did not open it. She did not need to, because everything it represented had already been expressed, not in written form, but in action, in presence, in the refusal to leave when leaving would have been easier. William stepped back slightly, giving her space without withdrawing entirely, his role in the moment complete, not because the situation was over, but because it had reached a point where it no longer required his influence, and that, more than anything, was the measure of what had been achieved. The room began to move again, not in the same way it had before, but with a quiet rhythm, one shaped by awareness rather than assumption. Conversations resumed, but softer, more deliberate, as if each word carried a bit more weight than it had earlier in the evening, and though the music had never stopped, it now felt different, less like background noise and more like something that filled the space between thoughts. Nia reached for her bag, lifting it with ease, the same bag that had been at the center of everything, and for a moment, her fingers paused on the strap, not in hesitation, but in reflection, because she knew that what had happened here would not stay contained within these walls. It would follow, in memory, in behavior, in the quiet decisions people made the next time they encountered something that did not fit their expectations. She glanced once more at William, and this time, there was a small nod, not formal, not performative, just a simple acknowledgement of a moment shared, of a line crossed and redefined, and William returned it with the same quiet understanding, because some exchanges do not require words to be complete. As Nia turned and walked toward the exit, the soft glow of the restaurant lights following her steps, it became clear that the real impact of the night would not be measured in what had been said or done in that moment, but in what would be remembered afterward, in the way people would pause before assuming, question before concluding, and stand before stepping away. And as the door opened and the cool night air brushed against the warmth of the room, carrying her forward into the city beyond, the space she left behind did not feel empty. It felt changed, permanently, quietly, undeniably.